We continue this week in Matthew chapter 5 for our New Testament reading, which comes from verses 13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. It's a trite phrase that almost isn't worth repeating, except to reveal its inaccuracy. We all know that names and words can hurt. I grew up with an older brother, so I know a few things about name calling. I have been on the giving and the receiving end of that age-old tradition many times. But not all names are bad. I had some cool nicknames throughout middle school and high school and college, and I have taken a few different personality type indicators to tell me more about who I am, introvert, and how I operate in the world. We all take on different names and titles throughout our lives, ways that we identify as we grow and participate in community. I think that was a beautiful part of how we got started with Growing Young this past Wednesday night, as we were led by guest presenter Andy Jung from CBF North Carolina. At the very beginning, even before we officially began the PowerPoint, Andy just wanted to take a few minutes to get to know our church a little bit. So he invited us, introverts and all, to share who we were and what we do at Lindley Park. Deacon, clerk, pastoral relations committee, Sunday school teacher, gardener, arts team leader, praise team member, and whatever June tells me were among the responses. From my seat at the back table, it was inspiring to hear all the titles that we carry here, the responsibilities that you take on as servants and leaders of our church. I hope you know that I am grateful for all of you, for all you do to lead and to pitch in, even in the smallest ways. Because I think we will see today that just a little bit can go a long way. It's important for us to name for ourselves who we are and what we are about. I suspect we all know something about the power of naming, how we have this way of becoming what we are named or what we are called. Psychologists have shown that for every negative message children receive about themselves, it takes 10 positive messages to get their self-esteem back to where it was. Another way of saying that is, if you call a child bad long enough, eventually that child will internalize that and externally act out what she believes about herself. And that goes for more than children, too. If you call someone worthless, if you call someone unlovable, if you call someone not good enough or embarrassing or shameful, if you call a person that long enough, frequently enough, odds are that eventually that person will live into that name. And of course, the same holds true for positive things, too. If you call someone valuable or effective or worthwhile or notable, important, significant. If you call someone a minister or a leader or a friend, for instance, eventually that person just might live into that name, even if they don't always feel like it. Remember where Jesus is when he says, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." He's on the same mountainside as last week, where his newly called disciples and a whole crowd of other folks have followed him up to a place where he has been calling them names. He's been calling them blessed. He's been calling out to people who are poor in spirit and meek and beaten up and beaten down. He's calling them something probably next to no one has ever called them. He says, "You are salt. You are light." And as just about every biblical commentary you will ever read points out, Jesus speaks in the present tense. You are salt. You are light. He doesn't say you were salt. Once upon a time, you used to be something important that adds some real flavor. Now, not so much. But boy, there was a time when you were salty. In a church age that has seen better days and numbers across the board, that kind of thinking is what we may hear more often than not about the things that we used to be. But Jesus begs to differ. He isn't caught up in the yearnings of the past, wringing his hands over how things have changed and wondering what happens next. Sitting on the mountainside with his newfound followers and a crowd of eager listeners, he has something more hopeful to offer. Jesus has a clear declaration of who and what his followers are, whether they know it or believe it or feel it or not. They are salt, whether they feel flavorful or not. They are light, regardless of whether they feel particularly shiny. He says, "You are salt," right here in the present. It's unearned, it's unconditional, and it's uncompromising. It isn't if you have the right theology, or if you vote a certain way, or if you try hard enough, or have the right attitude, or the right skin color, or the right bank account, or the right job title, or the right family life, then you might become salt. That isn't what he says. You are the salt of the earth. Jesus isn't giving his listeners a new role to play here. Rather, he is naming who we already are. We don't have to work to become salt and light. God made us this way, blessing us with gifts that can bless the world. But we do have to claim and embrace and live out these gifts. We do have to actually be salty and luminous. We do have to fulfill and embody what our gifts make possible. We have to be who we are. And who we are is precious. With table salt available at a nearby grocery store for around $2, it's easy to miss this in our modern world, where salt is cheap and plentiful. But imagine what Jesus' first followers would have heard when he called them salt. Remember who they were, that they were the sorts of people Jesus addressed in the Sermon on the Mount, that they were the poor, the mournful, the meek, the persecuted. They were hungry and sick and frightened. They were the outcast, the misfit and the disreputable. You, speaking to each person there, you are the salt of the earth. You who are not cleaned up and shiny and well-fed and fashionable. You who have known rejection. You who have been wounded and loved and forgotten. You are essential. You are worthwhile. You are treasured. For all of us who have spent months or years trying to earn divine favor, believing that our piety might someday make us precious in God's eyes, I hope that Jesus' teaching today will stop us in our tracks. Jesus knowingly named a commodity that was priceless in his time and place. He conferred great value on those who did not consider themselves valuable. And he does that again this morning for us, for you and me. Salt was valuable in Jesus' day. Its versatility was prized, applicable in many different ways, as a healing agent and as a purifier. It was also used to preserve food, to give it flavor and savor, like in bacon or a country ham biscuit. Because of its usefulness, salt was also used as a currency, believe it or not. Special salt rations given to early Roman soldiers were known as salarium argentum, the forerunner of the English word salary. When Jesus called his hearers salt, it was a high compliment. It was high praise to be considered as valuable and as essential as salt. This identity comes with a warning, however, because Jesus warns if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, there are lots of chemists who can tell you that sodium chloride is highly stable and technically cannot lose its flavor. But that's pure sodium chloride. The salt in Jesus' day was not like the salt that we find on our tables or in our pantries at home. The salt then had carried lots of impurities. And so when those impurities could combine with the humidity of the climate, salt could lose its usefulness, but only if it went unused. Salt can lose its quality if it is diluted, if it is poorly applied, or if it is stored for too long. Once diluted, diminished, dispersed, or destroyed, salt cannot get its flavor back. In such a state, something even as valuable as salt becomes unnoticeable and gets trampled on. So I hope that what we can see here is that salt does its best work when it is poured out, when it is scattered, when it dissolves into what is around it. We do our favorite recipes no favors if we always keep the salt shaker locked in the kitchen cabinet. What happens then? What happens to salt that's left in a kitchen cabinet? It gets clumpy. It gets stuck together. It sinks to the bottom. And salt is not meant to cluster. It's not meant to sink. Salt is meant to give of itself. It is meant to share its unique flavor in order to bring out the best in all that surrounds it. Which means that if we want to enliven, enhance, deepen, and preserve the world we live in, we must not hide within the walls of our churches. We must not cluster and congregate simply for our own comfort. We must not retreat into our pious theological bubbles out of fear, cynicism, shame, or self-righteousness. Salt doesn't exist to preserve itself. It exists to preserve what is not itself. Remember, we are salt. It's not a question of striving to become what we are not. It's a question of living into the precious fullness of who we already are. And likewise, Jesus says we are light. We are needed for the world to see the colors and the wonders of God that are out there in the world. Our lives and our faith reveal to others the goodness of God, the promise of God, and the hope that we have as people of God, even and especially in the darkness. I was reminded this week of a story from our national neighbors to the north, written by Warren Hudson of Ontario, Canada. He writes, "One night at the end of a special Saturday night worship service, a thunderstorm unleashed a bolt of lightning that plunged the church into darkness. With the congregation seated in total darkness, the pastor felt his way to the kitchen to find some candles. The pastor handed out the candles to everyone present, and the parishioners lit their candles in much the same way that we do here on Christmas Eve, each person lighting the candle of the person next to them. The worshipers then made their way through the church's winding hallways to the front door. Peering out, we could see the rain coming down in sheets, Warren remembers. With traffic snarled, people were running for the nearest shelter. Looking around, they realized that the entire city was in darkness. There in the darkness we stood, Warren writes. A little band of Christians, each clutching a light, not sure whether to venture out into the storm or stay inside the church in hopes that the storm would soon blow over. Isn't this an appropriate analogy for many of us in the church? We know that there is a world out there enshrouded in darkness. There is a world out there that is bland and in need of spice. But what do we do about it? Do we face the storm and shine our light? Do we add some spice to the world? We're not told how that story ends for the congregation in Canada. I like to imagine that they might have gone out into the street, bearing their precious gifts of light to guide wet wanderers to safety in the sanctuary. Through these earthy metaphors of salt and light, Jesus makes it clear that it isn't enough to simply be blessed and believe. He's trying to tell us how important we are, especially when we are open and sharing and shining. As I thought about that this week, I was reminded of another episode in a favorite television show, The Andy Griffith Show. This episode is in my top 3 favorites, and I have heard that it was Andy Griffith's own favorite episode, Opie the Birdman. Just as a recap, in this episode, Opie makes a slingshot, and he goes outside to test out his new toy. But Opie soon discovers the destructive potential he has, firing at a rustle in the trees in his front yard and killing a bird in the process. The distraught Opie can't stand the sight of what he's done, and Andy soon figures out what has happened. Opie then decides that he will be responsible for taking care of the baby birds that are left behind without their mother. He gets a cage and cares for the birds for a few weeks until they are strong enough to fly on their own. And at the end of the episode, Andy and Opie are on their front porch. The time has come to release the birds back into the trees. All 3, Winkin, Blinkin, and Nod, make their way out safely. And what follows is one of the most poignant moments in the show. Opie looks at Andy and says, "The cage sure looks awful empty, don't it, Pa?" Andy replies, "Yes, son, it sure does. But don't the trees seem nice and full?" If we listen closely to the sheriff from Mayberry, we might hear some echoes of a preacher from Nazareth who calls us to share the salt and the light that we are with the world, to open up the cage. Salt and light are meant to be shared, not hidden. They are meant to enhance the world around us. And similarly, Jesus has come to enhance our understanding of God's law and the Spirit and presence in the world. Jesus makes it clear that he has not come to abolish the law. He has not come to hide it, to cover over it, to distort it, to dilute it, or to destroy it, but to fulfill it, to bring it to completion and stand as a city on a hill for all to see. Jesus comes to give us an example of a fulfillment of the law. And the one who fulfills the law is righteous. Jesus comes to give us an example of what righteousness looks like and tastes like. Not the foul-tasting bitterness and corrosion that comes from the Pharisees, but a gentle, grounded firmness and fairness that flows from God's grace. It isn't about the grammar or the oral traditions or the theological recitations. It isn't about the knowing and the understanding of the law, the letter of the law. It is about living the spirit of it. It's about sharing the meaning of the law, like salt, like light. That is when the world becomes truly filled and the righteousness of God is fulfilled. The bottom line is this: superficially following the law isn't enough. And superficially following Jesus isn't either. What really counts is to fulfill the law, to embody its meaning, its spirit and its substance. And doing so may well take on some surprising forms. Jesus has not come to do away with tradition, but to enrich it and to renew the spirit of it. Like salt or light, the fulfillment we have found in Christ isn't meant to be hidden away in a cupboard or under a bucket. Being fulfilled in the kingdom means the world tastes better. It looks more radiant. And it is more fulfilling because of how we choose to serve Christ and follow his laws of love and peace and generosity. So the next time someone asks you who you are or what you do, I wonder if you might pause and think about how you are salt and light, that you are precious and treasured, no matter what anyone else may say. So let's open up the cupboard, turn on the light, and keep telling the story of Jesus. Amen.